Thank you, Professor Quinn. Can everyone hear me? I just want to be sure my audio is working properly.
Yes.
And thank you, Professor Quinn, for this great introduction. I wasn't expecting that, honestly. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about some of the ideas that I have been thinking about for the past couple of years. And so today's talk is going to be part of my research project. And as Professor Quinn rightly mentioned, it also comes from my many years in grassroots peace building and what I have observed, the challenges that I've had, and what I think the future is for me. And so I titled today's talk as Charting a Course to Measures of Non-Recurrence, the Possibilities and Limits of Customary Justice. In other words, what does customary justice has to offer in terms of moving towards measures of non-recurrence? And the subject of measures of non-recurrence arguably is one of the lesser known transitional justice instruments. And so I'll focus today's presentation really much on it. I have decided to talk for a very short time, and so that we'll have enough time for discussion, which is very important for me as I continue my research work into the future. So before I proceed, I would like to share with you the roadmap I have for today, and that will be the guide for our talk today. So I'll first talk about what measures of non-recurrence are, what value they add to the transitional justice toolbox, and how they differ from or complement other TJ instruments. From there, I'll talk about the nature of the problem that we need to address. And then I'll proceed to talk about why customary justice practices matter to measures of non-recurrence. Then I'll move to share with you some of my ideas and thinking around the prospects and opportunities that customary justice offers towards measures of non-recurrence. I'll end my presentation today with some challenges that might occur as we talk about customary justices and non-recurrence. And those challenges that I was sharing with you actually form the basis for my future research projects, work that I'll continue to be working on. So, what are measures of non-recurrence and how do they differ from or complement other TJ instruments? First, I would like to make a note on terminology before I proceed to talk about what measures of non-recurrence are. So this is quite a concept that you find different names. Others, some in the literature, you will find guarantees of non-repetition or guarantees of non-recurrence or assurances of non-repetition. If you go deeper into it, there are subtle differences in the meaning, but for the most part, these concepts, terminologies are used interchangeably. So for today's talk, I will be using them interchangeably, but I sometimes prefer to use measures of non-recurrence instead of guarantees of non-repetition because I think the word guarantee is quite strong for me. And honestly, like as Rod Areza rightly puts it, there's no transitional justice measure or peace building measure that can definitively guarantee that violations will not occur again or will not get violence recurring in the future. And so instead of the word guarantee, sometimes I prefer to use measures of non-recurrence. So measures of non-recurrence encompasses the transitional justice measures that mostly directly aim at prevention. They are generally defined as efforts to stop and prevent the future reoccurrence of armed conflict or to prevent the continuation of human rights violations, especially in cases where the risk of the continuation of conflict is high or the continuation of human rights violations is high. So what are measures of non-recurrence and how do they differ? So I would like to draw some comparisons. To really show how they might differ or complement other TJ mechanisms. So for example, criminal prosecutions or retributive justice may have punitive character or they might be aimed at criminal accountability. And reparations have a reparative functions or they aim to repair past harms that have been suffered. And truth-telling, among other things, are aimed at truth-seeking, of course, acknowledgement, reconciliation, and many others. So to some extent, one could argue that reparation, criminal prosecutions, and truth-telling are focused on the past, or they are backward-looking. Of course, we know that truth commissions make recommendations sometimes to improve the future, but primarily they look at finding out what has happened in the past. And reparations look at addressing the past harms, and then individual criminal accountability seeks to hold people who have committed crimes accountable. So on the contrary, measures of non-recurrence are fundamentally future-looking. They are aimed at preventing the future reversion to armed conflict. So how do they complement other TJ measures? So in TJ and other peace-building instruments, we should aim at ensuring that our interventions do not just aim to prosecute perpetrators or provide reparations or to tell the truth of what happened in the past, but also to put in place measures to ensure the non-repetition of future conflicts. So in the next slide, I'll be talking to you what is the nature of the problem that we need to address. So before I go into telling the nature, I need to give you some context and historical background about the concept of measures of non-recurrence. This historical background will be helpful in understanding the nature that is in front of us that we need to address. So measures of non-recurrence, they have a long history, dating back to the 18th century, but I'm not going to bore you today with a long history of measures of non-recurrence. Instead, I'll fast forward to the concept's appearance in the United Nations Principles on the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights and other principles to combat impunity. This is important because it is through these UN principles that the notion of measures of non-recurrence transformed into TJ instruments. And then we began to see their application in post-conflict context. So measures of non-recurrence first appeared in the UN system in the UN Special Rapporteur Theo van Balvin's report on the principles and guidelines on the right to reparation for victims of gross violations of human rights and humanitarian law. So in that report, it was recommended that reparation should include restitution, compensation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-recurrence. And so as you can see, the word guarantees of non-recurrence appeared in that report. And this is probably around the time that the UN started thinking about this concept. And following that report, different subcommissions of the United Nations and including the work of the International Law Commission on State Responsibility have made revisions to these guidelines on how to combat impunity. But the key takeaway I want to stress here is that these discussions on how to combat impunity and to protect human rights, among other things, originated in the UN at the time of political transitions from authoritarian regimes to potential democratic governance in Latin America mostly and other African countries, where the rates of human rights violations were higher. So at that time, violence and human rights abuses was, for the most part, vertical in nature. That is to say, the state was the principal perpetrator of violence and abuses of human rights violations on its citizens. And this was mostly achieved through state-sanctioned operations and through state security apparatus and other summary executions. So because violence was primarily committed by state establishments, the measures were primarily aimed at state institutions. So they were measures taken by states to prevent the abuse of state power. So they were largely aimed to reform abusive state structures and systems that allowed or facilitated or promoted violations in some way or the other. Now, for example, there were vetting going on to screen out abusive officials from office. They reformed state institutions to make them more accountable to their citizens. Laws were put in place that protected human rights abusers, and they adopted international norms to be more accountable to the international community, and emergency calls were also abolished. So these were some of the things that were put in place at that time. But the problem is, after the wave of democratic transitions, the concept of measures of non-recurrence is applied in a radically different context, and for my purpose, in the context of African civil wars and armed conflict. So these same interventions that were used during the transitions are now being applied in post-conflict societies without much consideration to the specific context that they are applied. So in the next slide, I will illustrate the contextual differences between then and now that will give more clarity to the nature of the problem. So let's look at our next slide now. What are the contextual differences then and now? So at that time, there was clear transition, or at least the objective was a clear transition from authoritarian regimes to hopefully democracy. I say hopefully because that was the intent. But whether some countries actually did transfer to transit to democracy is a different topic that is beyond the scope of today's presentation. The second difference is that in the present context, civil wars and armed conflicts, the state is just one player among many players of non-state armed actors. And quite frankly, the state sometimes is very weak. And the non-state armed actors seems to be, in some cases, more deadly and commit more violations than the state. Although, of course, in most of the armed conflicts in Africa, the state is still a principal actor. This is not to discount their role at all. They are still a great player, but the important point here is that now we see many, many more non-state armed actors involved in armed conflicts. And as a result, we have violence being more localized and dispersed, unlike before. So although some of the conflicts might have national dimensions, the violence is quite localized. It could be maybe one small community against the other, or one non-state actor or a group of non-state actors against the other. But this wasn't primarily the case during the democratic transitions. So as a result of the fact that the dynamics of conflict itself has changed, the actors have changed, the continuation of using these same measures that were primarily state-centered because they were designed to deal with abusive state power seems not to be resulting in the kind of achievements that we aim to see. So this is where the problem is. And then the idea of looking elsewhere to see what we might do towards terminating violence and achieving non-recurrence brings in the conversation of customary justice and other traditional forms of peacemaking. So in the next slide, I'll be talking about why do customary justice practices matter? Or why is it important that we bring in customary justices and other traditional measures of conflict resolution into the conversation? First of all, as I mentioned earlier, in recent civil wars, especially in Africa, there are so many actors. And the method of operations or their mode of operation tend to be closely connected to the local communities in many ways. For example, non-state armed groups are often based at the grassroots community level, where these areas sometimes are beyond the control of state authority or state power. They often draw their support from local constituencies or local authorities. These local armed actors sometimes are based on various identity markers also, which are more pronounced at the local level, although we can have them at different levels, but they are more pronounced at the local level. And issues of identity becomes more salient when you go deeper into the micro level analysis of conflict resolution. And sometimes these non-state actors pay allegiance to their traditional authorities and local institutions. And even more so, some of them actually in support from local leaders and their traditional institutions. So this is one of it, but the other important reason why customary justice is important is that the contextual understanding of the notion of peace, justice, and conflict in many of these societies experiencing civil wars and armed conflicts is quite different from what we understand justice and peace to mean in the Western context. So the Western notion of justice is often equated sometimes with criminal prosecutions or retributive justice. But in some of these communities, the notion of peace and justice is quite broad and multidimensional, which includes values of peace, reconciliation, the restoration of community harmony. And these are mostly drawn upon through mostly non-judicial means. So these are some of the reasons why traditional forms of conflict resolution and customary justice matters in this conversation. And so in the next slide, I'm going to share with you some of my thinking around the prospects or the potential pathways that we might pursue to achieving measures of non-recurrence. But in today's discussion, I will not go very deep into these discussions. I'll just give you an overview of them. In the coming few weeks, I'll be talking in detail about the mechanisms and how these things that might work in my public lecture, which is coming up in the next couple of weeks. But my thinking is around how we might focus more or emphasize more on the social dimensions of community-led integration of ex-combatants. Because reintegration processes seems to be more focused on the economic and security dimensions of it. But there are social aspects where we think about the receiving community or the host communities that might be receiving these ex-combatants and the social processes that we might draw upon through customary justices that can ensure that these ex-combatants really do not have the capacity to stay within the community without reigniting violence within the communities. The other area that I'm thinking about has to do with locally negotiated peace agreements. So beyond the bigger peace at the bigger negotiation table, which happens at a much bigger level, what can community-based negotiated peace agreements that are within the confines of traditional conflict mechanisms, using traditional practices, can offer? What can this offer in terms of terminating violence and preventing violence? As I have mentioned earlier, the violence is more dispersed and localized. So there seems to be opportunities where we can make pockets of peace between and among individual communities, and in aggregation, see how we can terminate violence from that local level then, and see how that can spread out. And my thinking is that stopping the recurrence of violence will be much more sustainable if we are able to stop it at the local level where it is more dispersed and localized than the bigger, so-called bigger peace that normally happens at the negotiation table, where we have international community, most likely facilitated by the international community. The third aspect I'm thinking about is emphasizing the future orientation and future-looking orientation of community social accountability and control practices. And what I mean is, customary justice practices have inherently some social control and accountability practices that seems to be able to put an eye, so to speak, on potential non-state armed groups. And if we are able to work around those kind of social control and accountability aspects of customary justices, then we might be able to consolidating peace and ensuring that people do not return to violence. So as I promised, my next slide will be on the challenges that we might face, and that's just about it for today. So in thinking about what customary justice has to offer towards measures of non-repetition, there are many challenges on the way, and it's not unique to customary justices. Just like many peace building approaches or transitional justice instruments, there are so many challenges that are ahead. And I'm not going to talk into all of them. I'm just going to mention two. And as I said in my introductory slide, these challenges that I'm going to talk about are the basis or forms my future research agenda, which I'll be working on the next coming years, and maybe probably the rest of my academic life, most likely. And so the main two ones that I want to talk about today, the first one is what I term, how do we achieve trickle out and or up effect, both horizontally and vertically. So what I mean by this is that, how can customary justice move from their grassroots origins or local origins to have wider effects so that they can complement, coexist, or integrate with other TJ mechanisms, both upwards, up to the national level, and maybe to international level, and also across different communities. And this is important because customary justice tend to be implemented in isolation from other TJ mechanisms. But that shouldn't be the case. They are supposed to be part of a comprehensive TJ strategy in which they can positively reinforce each other to prevent the reoccurrence of armed conflict and attain long-term peace. And I think that it is because customary justice tend to be implemented in isolation is the reason why sometimes the national actors, international actors tend to see customary justices as a second best alternative, because they think or they believe or they are implemented or they have a very narrow effect, at a very narrow effect. Of course, that is one of the benefits of customary justice, that they are narrow, they are specific. But of course, we need to start thinking of how they can go outside of their grassroots origins to have wider effects, both in terms of working alongside other national TGA processes, formal TGA processes, so to speak, and also across other communities. So this is one of the things that I've been thinking about, and it's definitely going to be part of my future research agenda, which I'm thinking, which I'll be pursuing. The other challenge, which is important to me, is how do we minimize the excesses of customary justice while we maintain their flexibility and cultural resonance? What I mean here is that there is, of course, we have a lot of research in the literature that criticize customary justice for being gender insensitive, for sometimes reinforcing unequal power relations at the local level, sometimes being abusive, and local authorities are exploiting them and then using them for their own benefit, and all of those criticisms. There are many of them. So my concern, how do we take advantage of the positive aspects of these traditional systems of conflict resolution, while ensuring that we minimize and manage these excesses, these problems that they might have in terms of being gender blind, being reinforcing unequal power relations at the local level. But in thinking about that, it also opens up other challenges also. And that is, if we are to start thinking about how to make sure that they are not discriminatory, they are not gender blind, then we have to begin to be thinking of how we can put boundaries and around customary justices and standardize them in some way so that they might, so to speak, meet other established norms and conventions. But in doing so, we might run into the problem of, for example, what Rosemary Nagy referred to as one-sizing customary justice or one-sizing transitional justice. Because one of the main criticisms of the neoliberal or the liberal piece is that they are one-sized. And if you begin to think about standardizing or putting boundaries around customary justice, then we risk one-sizing customary justice also. So the challenge here I'm thinking about is, how do we make sure that we minimize these problems that customary justice have without one-sizing them or putting so much restriction on them, so that they still remain their flexibility and cultural resonance while we are able to draw upon the many benefits that they have to offer. So thank you so much. And this is the end of my presentation, my talk today.
Thank you so much, Isaac. And let me ask all of you to join me in thanking Isaac for a great talk. And happily, we have some time left for some questions. So let me